Okay, thanks for being with me again in our study of grave concerns, looking at the afterlife of man in the immaterial part. And of course, we'll look at what God does with the resurrection and so forth. It's a very interesting subject. And so we're going to start today in our second video here. I've called it Sorting Out Some Details, and just talk about what we have uh, covered in our first part here. Um, we're talking about angels in part of this, not because the subject is angels, but because angels are involved in the beginning of it, and we need to touch base on what God has done there. So we said God created angels when He created angels very early in the creation week. I understand that they were pure spirit, they were immaterial, and later God created man. But when we saw when God created man both material and immaterial. We have a physical side and a spiritual and soul side here. Lucifer, who was a created being in heaven, a pure spirit, rebelled against God, and he became known as Satan. Here, he brought sin into God's creation, into the invisible world, and eventually when he brought the first sin into the world, and for that God created something called everlasting fire. We see that in Matthew 25:41, and that fire was created for the devil and his angels. So there was no redemption for angels as well. We see that clearly that there is no redemption for angels in Scripture. Now Satan uh, brought his wiles down into the earth. He had rebelled against God. And he was going to bring his rebellion in the invisible world to the visible world. And eventually, with his encouragement, man did sin, and now God had to deal with um, man being in sin. And the result would be that the body would die. At least it starts the death process immediately. Adam and Eve both in the Garden of Eden after the fall began the death process, but the spiritual death that was immediate, and they was separated from God. They were spiritually dead, and that was a result of the sin that came into the world. So, but unknown to Satan, but known, of course, to God, that when man sinned, it was not final. Uh, God introduced the idea of redemption, that man could be redeemed. I have a two-part series on my YouTube channel. The most amazing thing is that angels were not redeemable, but man is. God promised that man could be redeemed. Now that creates interesting situation here that God has to deal with the body of man. What's going to happen to that? What's going to happen to the immaterial part of the redeemed, and what's going to happen to the part of the immaterial, the unredeemed. So we'll see that as we go through our study. That's where we're looking at that God will deal with these things as well. So um, we see that when sin entered the world, there has to be an end of each of these categories here as well, as we go on to our study here. Our study will address God's program, God's orderly arrangement of what He's going to do with each one of these classes of immaterial part of man. And uh, I put a little geography and celestial mapping here. We're going to have to look at where things are, where people go. So we have to look from a geography point of view. Geography is points to the Earth. Celestial mapping would point to the heavens or astronomy. Um, Yet that is only the visible world when we see it from a man's point of view. But we also have to consider from the invisible point of view. We talked about heaven, the three heavens, the part of the heavens where the uh, birds fly. There's a second heaven where the angels fly and the astronauts, and the third heaven is the abode of God. Yet the invisible heavens we don't see, yet they are really there, and we have to include that into our study. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we start getting geography from that because we know God created the earth, but God also created the invisible part of the earth. So we can easily figure out geography of the Earth. That's where we live. We can start with the big picture of the Earth. We can start subdividing that into locations, into maps and so forth, and cities. But the first geographical reference, just for a point of interest here, in Scripture is in Genesis 2:8, where God said He created a garden eastward called Eden. So the first geographic reference in the Bible is, of course, the word Eden. That is a location where God created the garden for Adam and his wife. And the heavens, as I mentioned, are subdivided into the first heaven, and that is the atmosphere where our birds fly around us. And the second heaven would be where the astronauts fly, and also, I believe, angels spend much time there as well. Then we have the third heaven, and you can see how that is explained when Paul mentions a man going up into the third heaven, a place called paradise, he called it, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 2 through 4. Take a look at those references. Paul mentions that, and that's where we see the reference to the third heaven. So uh, it's a reminder here that God made both visible and invisible when things were created. While we can see the visible world, the invisible world is not seen by us, but it's just as valid. It's just as valid as what we can see. And some of our locations that we'll talk about will be in the invisible part of the world. And so as we go on, to keep that in mind as we start deciding where things are going to go, where people will be after death, and will they be for eternity. So we're concerned with these locations as we work this out here. Some of the names we'll look at in Scripture here, and we'll sort these out as we go through here. We're going to talk about things words that are used in the King James Version and in the original languages. We have the word hell, which is very common in the Bible, but very confusing. We'll talk about that. Uh, Also, the pit and grave will also are words in the Old Testament, and all these words that I just mentioned, they are translated as the Hebrew word Sheol, which we'll talk about a lot as we go through the study. In the New Testament, we'll talk about the Greek word Hades, which is synonymous with the Old Testament Sheol. Gehenna, interesting word. We'll talk about this a word that seems to be introduced by Jesus himself when he taught. Uh, We find that in the New Testament in the Greek. A word paradise we find as well. It seems to be a descriptive term. And two other words that we probably won't spend too much time on, may hit them in passing, is the Tartarus and Abyss. Usually these are locations for demonic beings, but not for humans. And of course, the lake of fire, which we'll hit on at the end of our study. Very important part of our study, but very sad to think of it as well. So let's talk about the word hell in the English Bible. We have to sort this out because it is kind of almost a catch-all word that gives us a problem here if we start using that word hell, because it doesn't always refer to the same thing. I find this word in the King James Version 54 times. And you can use Bible software to search these things or take a concordance. Uh, I'm not sure I could read a concordance anymore. Those used to be just tiny writings and Strong's exhaustive concordance. But you can get those things now in Bible software. I have software on my phone called Olive Tree, and I have a version of the King James in there that you can tap on a word, and it will give you the Strong's numbers and the definition. So those things are very helpful for us as we're studying Scripture to sort things out as well. But uh, as I say, the word hell is translated from four different words in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament included. The Old Testament uses the Hebrew word, I'll say, is Sheol, and we'll use that word a lot in place of the word hell because now we know what we're talking about. We're talking about the original language, and so that is there very common in the Old Testament. And Sheol, although it appears more times than just the 31 times it translated as hell, it's very common in the Old Testament. Hell in the Old Testament was always the Hebrew word Sheol. So if you see hell, it's in the Old Testament, it's Sheol. Not true in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, always is the same word. Um, In the English version of the New Testament, the word here, the Greek word that's synonymous with, we'll see, with Sheol um, is the word Hades. But we also have the word Gehenna, which we'll talk about a little later. Jesus introduced that, and we'll see that in our study here as well. Uh, in the Hebrew, the word Sheol is also translated, as I mentioned, grave and pit. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at the Old Testament verses, when we're referring to kind of figure out what Sheol is. Uh, so, including including the word hell and other translations, the word Sheol is listed 63 times in the Old Testament. And so, again, if you're using Bible software, or you can actually search the Strong's number for that and look at all the verses, whether they're translated hell, pit, or grave, and you can see all the verses. The software I use will do that for me. It helps me sort it out relatively quickly. So 4 times in the grave, but it's always the word Sheol, and it's always uh, in the context of somebody dead or dying here. So to end the confusion as we go through the study, I normally won't use the word hell. I'll try to substitute the word Sheol or Hades, so we'll be in the same context and know exactly what we're talking about here. If the word was pit or the word was hell, we'll use the word Sheol, so we know we're talking about the same location. So again, we'll look at Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, paradise, and a few other words as we go through the study. So the word Sheol and Hades, we'll discuss as we go through here, and they are, in fact, I'm going to say Hades is the direct translation of the Old Testament Sheol, but the meaning is not necessarily synonymous. The word Sheol was used in a broader sense in the Old Testament than Hades is in the New Testament. Words that we can confirm that this is the case is Psalm 16 verse 10. I'm going to play that for you here, and let me see what I have here.
For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell Sheol, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption.
Okay, so I put the word in that text there. Hell is the word that's in the King James, but Sheol is the original language. But Peter referred to the same verse, and he quoted the same verse in the New Testament, and he was in the recorded in the Greek from the original Hebrew.
Because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell Hades, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption.
So I use those two verses to show that the two verses, that the word Sheol and Hades are synonymous in going from the Hebrew to the Greek. As we go through here, we'll see that Hades is used a little differently in the New Testament, and Sheol was used a little bit broader in the Old Testament. And so we have to look at the context as well. So let's look at some names and places here. Again, if you're looking up Sheol in the Old Testament and you want the Strong's numbers, that's 7585. And that's very helpful if those of us who do not speak Greek. I certainly don't. I don't speak Hebrew either. But I have these Bible helps that help me sort things out in Scripture as well. And I think in the Old Testament, uh, the doctrines we're talking about here are not developed yet. All Scripture is progressive and unfolding, and God gave more revelation over time, and they don't have a full understanding of what we do today, of what God has done and will be doing in the future, because it wasn't all given yet. The concept of what God was going to do with the disposition of souls and time could not be totally understood from the revelation that was given to date. Now, that bodies would go into the ground, that was very clear. People understood that. Somebody died, they buried them. But they had a limited understanding of what happened to the uh, immaterial part of man in the afterlife. The afterlife is far less developed in the Old Testament. The Old Testament really deals with the temporal world much more than the spiritual world, and So God, when Jesus came, he brought our thinking from the temporal world to the spiritual world, and we'll see that as we go through our study as well. So their understanding of the afterlife was very limited from what we have today. But again, without question, they knew that man's body was buried in the ground. That's where they placed him. But because the human eye could see that, the human eye could observe that, and they were buried in the ground in a good old age. Let me play this verse here from Genesis chapter 25, uh, verse 9.
Be buried in a good old age.
So that was a promise to Abraham that he would be buried in a good old age. That's what they expected to do. And I'm very impressed uh, beginning probably with Abraham. And let me play this verse here. When Sarah passed away, his wife of many years, she was quite old when she died.
Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre.
So I use the word, I say Machpelah. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation or not there, but um, Abraham buried his wife with great dignity and respect. And we see that in the Old Testament. Handling of the body was done with great respect, both to Abraham when he passed away as well by his children, and we see with how Jacob handles the burying of Rachel, and Leah ends up in the same tomb where Abraham was. And you go back and look at how Joseph dealt with the burial of Jacob when he died in Egypt, and they brought him back to the same place that Abraham buried Sarah. Great respect is given to the body in the Old Testament. I think that's important for us to see that they gave great dignity to this body that was created in God's image and likeness. And but exactly what happened with the afterlife, again, that is not quite as clear in the Old Testament. Uh, now, we use the word Sheol in the Old Testament often refers to just the grave, but there's indications that it was much more than that. That uh, the burial was in fact 6 feet under, or we say in a grave today. But they seem to understand it was a little more to that. But another observation is that in the Old Testament scripture that Sheol was more than just a burying, and that it wouldn't be occupied forever. It would be only a temporary location. Those that went down to the grave would come up again, and the full understanding of that is not really clear from the revelation given to that time. But some understood that resurrection would come, and resurrection is really much more expounded upon in the New Testament. And by the time you get to the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels all the way to the book of Revelation, we get a much better understanding of resurrection. But they didn't have that in the Old Testament. Now, going back to Samuel's mother, Hannah, she understood, and she giving her testimony when she knew that she would be having a son. This is her testimony. She said God would do this.
Bringeth down to Sheol and bringeth up.
So Sheol, and again, it was probably hell, given in, I have to go back and look. I put the Sheol word in this phrase here because that's what the original said. But she said God would bring us down to that location and bring us up again. So that's interesting to see that some of the Old Testament understood that it was only a temporary thing to be in that. Uh, if you go back and look at Job in chapter 19, he knew that he would see God again. He would be raised from Sheol. So there was some concept in the Old Testament of resurrection. Again, but it was very limited. When we get to the Gospel, the time of Jesus, if you remember the story uh, in uh, in John chapter 11, where Lazarus has died, Martha goes out and meets Jesus, and Jesus is having a conversation with her about the resurrection, that Lazarus would be raised again. And here's what Martha had to say.
Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day.
So by the time Jesus came to the earth, it was clear in Jewish scripture that men would again be raised from the dead. You can see that in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3, I think it is, where 2 and 3 and 4, that area he's talking about the resurrection. So go back and look at the early part of chapter 12 of of of, uh, of Daniel, and you can see that there was a concept that man would be raised from the dead. Uh, but so in the Old Testament, we see here the word Sheol indicates often just a grave where the body would go, but it goes beyond that, understanding that the immaterial part of man would be also in Sheol, but that they would not necessarily remain there. So we can ask the question, where is it? Where is Sheol? Well, I have gone through, and again, using my Bible helps here in the studies, sorting these words out. I've looked up every reference in the Old Testament on Sheol, and the overall direction of this is always down. We see that it's very clear that it is a location that goes down. The very first reference is Jacob talking about when Joseph is he's told that Joseph has died, but he was not dead, of course, but he was sold into Egypt. But he said he would his soul would go down to the grave. Jacob said about his death here when he heard about Joseph's passing, I guess, from his point of view, Joseph had passed, and it wasn't true that his brothers were lying.
For I will go down into Sheol unto my son mourning.
So I will go down to Sheol. I will go down to, again, the word, I'll go down to the grave here. I think in the original, I will go down, and we see here that he's going down to this location. Now, does that mean he's just going to be buried in the ground, or is he talking about his immaterial part? It's not really clear there, but it's always down, and the direction is down. Continually. It's this is not an isolated verse here as well. It's always a downward direction if you go through and look up all of them. It's sometimes referred to as down, lowest depth, uh, beneath, belly. So you see these words. It's usually a downward direction as well. Um, and Scripture shows that as well. If you go back to Korah's rebellion in Numbers 16. Uh, uh, the word there is used as Sheol. When he rebelled, uh, Moses asked God to open up the earth to swallow them up, and they would go down alive into Sheol, is the word that's given there. And the earth opened up and did, in fact, swallow them up. Now, again, what was Moses thinking here? Was he thinking about the material or immaterial part of man? It's not really clear to me in that as well, but the bodies, in fact, did open up and it went into the pit, it said, and that whole group was swallowed up into the earth. And Sheol was, in effect, down. They went into the pit, but the word there is, in fact, Sheol. So it is clear that Sheol is always down. It's clear that if we're going to get into geography here, Sheol itself would be down, which the only place down is in the earth itself. And can we see it? No, it's part of the invisible world, but in fact, it is clear that that's where Sheol is from Old Testament scripture here. So now that we know that Sheol is down, and I would say inside the earth, who's destined to go there? Well, in the Old Testament, it's really again, not everything is totally clear because they didn't have all the understanding of what we have in the New Testament. But we find that in Psalm 9, verse 17, that let me play this here, what he says about again, I put the word Sheol in here rather than hell or the pit of the grave.
The wicked shall be turned into Sheol.
The wicked shall go there. Okay, so we see that from here as well. But also Jacob saw it. We saw it either. Jacob said that he would go into Sheol. So he is. We know Jacob was a believer, and he would end up in the same place. So Jacob would end up in the same place as the wicked. So and Jacob was not. So we see in the Old Testament that both the just and the unjust will end up in Sheol. Uh, how much of this they understood? Again, it's not. You can't really develop the doctrine of the death, resurrection, of the immaterial part of man clearly from the Old Testament that was given. It really depended upon what's going to be coming in the New Testament, and that's where we'll go next in our next lesson. We're going to go to the New Testament, and it's amazing when you go through that. Much of our understanding of the afterlife was really introduced to us by the teachings of Jesus in his earthly ministry. So, our next lesson, we're going to get lights from the New Testament and sort out some of this stuff that's really, it seems to me, almost left ambiguous in the Old Testament. We know people knew that they would die, they knew the bodies went into the ground, but what happened to the immaterial part of man was really not clear. Just an interesting story here. I'll throw it. It's not in my notes here, but uh, and I think I have a video on this. Uh, the Witch of Endor, Saul's encounter with the Witch of Endor. Look up that video on my channel. Samuel had already died, and he was buried in the grave, and his immaterial part, his soul and spirit, was in Sheol in the earth. When Saul was at the end of his life, it was just before the last battle. God wasn't talking to him, and so he went to a woman that had dealt with spirits, and she was going to probably thought she would deceive him, thinking that she could fool him, that some demon may have given some information. But what God actually did was allow Samuel to arrive, and Samuel says, "Why have you brought me up?" Go back and read that account in First Samuel. And it's interesting that it's clear that uh, he came up from within the earth to speak to Saul at that time. So that's an interesting story in Scripture. Look up that video I have on my channel. I find that to be a fascinating story, but it does illustrate that Sheol at that time, the immaterial part of man, ended up in the earth. So we'll stop here for now. Thank you for spending time with me. Look forward to being with you in the next lesson. The next lesson will be what I have here, light from the New Testament. That's where we're going to enter into our next lesson, and it is fascinating stuff that we get, and there'll be at least two lessons from that, from the New Testament, things that Jesus taught. So thank you for being with me today, and I look forward to being with you again in the next lesson.